Hi everyone, good morning. Today is World Water Day, and we are here together to celebrate this important day in a critical way. So together with the NEWAVE, the Transformation to Groundwater Sustainability, and the European Climate Pact, we have organized an event on why visibility may not improve governability. And we have some critical questions about groundwater governance. So for today, the program will be organized in mainly two parts. We will now share the program of the day, and as you see, the first part of the session will be mainly panel discussion. And we are very fortunate to have among us some of the leading researchers and scholars in the field. And these panel presentations will be moderated by Dr. Emanuele Fantini, IHE Delft researcher. The panel presentations will last 10 minutes each, with 5 minutes of question and answers for every presentation. And then after the presentations, we will invite a number of extremely competent scholars and practitioners as discussant to react to the presentations. They will each have 5 minutes. And we will also, in that case, open up for questions and comments from the public. We aim at closing the events today at 12. So I would like now to invite and first of all acknowledge the funding and the support that as NEWAVE we receive from the European Commission. NEWAVE is an innovative training program that trains 15 early stage researchers, 15 PhD researchers on issues of water governance. Fundamentally, it's the first global water governance PhD network of this kind, funded by the Marie Curie Innovative Training Network programs. And this is also an event that is being made possible thanks to the support of the European Climate Pact. I would like to invite, following my brief presentation, Fons Janssen, who is the European Climate Pact representative in the Netherlands, which together with Caterina Marinetti, our NEWAVE scientific project manager, they're pushing forward this collaboration with the European Climate Pact. Fons, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jean-Paul, for giving the floor. Good morning, everybody, at least from the European time, but we have a global audience, which I very much like. And thanks for co-creating this together. My name is Fons Janssen. I'm the country coordinator of the European Climate Pact. And the Climate Pact is a very new program, so many of you probably don't know. But to start about this day of the World Water Day and also the focus theme on groundwater, a bit of my personal backstory, because stories in our social program, stories and personal motivation is very important. So I myself, I grew up and I still live in the southeast of the Netherlands with a mixed family farm, chickens and sheep for nature conservation and an elderly care facility. And so how our ecosystems and also how water reservoirs are doing is very important for my agricultural community, my village. 2 years ago, also 2020, the major nature reserve, the Pale, was full in fire, and water management was one of the causes, and the droughts because that were worsened by climate change really had a direct impact in my biggest nature park next to me. So I'm really glad that we are discussing this about the water governance of the groundwater. And with my program, I actually also try to contribute that with multiple ambassadors, of which Caterina is from NEWAVE. So the European Green Deal is like the overall umbrella policy review to manage the European climate and biodiversity goals. So it's really enriched, but it's also very large, that many people sometimes find difficulty to understand what Europe is already doing. And that's like also the reason why the pact has been formed. It's an initiative to increase awareness and action in Europe, but also beyond Europe, to make sure that we are reaching our climate goals that we have set with the Paris Agreement. And the European Green Deal is not only about geopolitics or finance or sector policy, it also has some social pillars. So we've got a European Social Climate Fund to compensate the people when we have harsh climate policy or biodiversity recovery policy. We've got fossil regions that we try to transition with a just transition mechanism to leave no one behind. And then we've got my program, the European Climate Pact. It's an initiative to leverage sustainable action. So citizens, but also organizations across Europe and the globe are like invited to learn about climate change, to develop and spread bottom-up solutions, and to connect with each other to find the synergies to make the impact. And the pact, interestingly enough, is really like crowdsourced. So people from all over Europe had to say in how the pact should be formed. And we created these 6 pillars of core values that we have before you can become an ambassador. But you cannot only be an ambassador when you're living in Europe. If you have a strong connection to Europe with collaborations, for instance, with the African Union European Youth Hub or the Eastern and Southern Neighborhood Program, you can also team up with Europe when you have like a common goal for climate change, climate action and biodiversity recovery. So for individuals, it's really about improving your own visibility to show your ambassadorship that you are up for sustainability, and so to increase your capacity building. It's both for people that make their first step to create a sustainable future, but also climate champions that want to get this European boost. But also business and decentral governments can take part in it, because the European Commission is really calling on all civil society, governments, business to proactively talk about climate action and how we can increase the speed of action, because time is crucial. As a country coordinator, I'm doing mainly 3 things. I support a very diverse network of Climate Pact ambassadors located in the Netherlands. Some of them are really Dutch, some are like European experts or non-European experts living in the Netherlands that I support with their actions. You can see them here on the screen, but I also form strategic partnerships with national organizations in the government, the Dutch government, and also I do social analysis and how we can increase the climate movement overall. What are the developments of the Netherlands and what can we learn from neighboring countries and vice versa. So good luck with the webinar, and yeah, no action is too small, and I'm really glad that we're doing this, because I think it really helps to connect the various levels of Netherlands, Europe and the world, how we make sure that we can celebrate World Water Day many more times with like increasing quality of life and environment. So thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Fons, and thank you and Caterina Marinetti for organizing this wonderful synergy between different organizations. And we will now start with our panel. And I would like to invite on our virtual stage 3 researchers that really don't need any presentation. First of all, Professor Margreet Zwarteveen. She's professor of water governance at IHE Delft and a leading thinker, critical thinker in the field of water governance. Her presentation will be followed by Professor François Molle. He's professor at the Institute for Research and Development in Montpellier. Also, in this case, François really doesn't need any presentation. He's one of the critical social scientists working in the field of water governance. That has influenced the field in ways that cannot be even described. And then the third presentation will be from Dr. Himanshu Kulkarni. Dr. Kulkarni is the Executive Director of the Advanced Center for Water Resources Development and Management. And while it seems that many international organizations are recognizing that groundwater is important today, Dr. Kulkarni has been working on groundwater since 1998. So in his case, this has been a long awareness. The panel will be moderated by Emanuele Fantini, which I referred to earlier, a researcher and activist at IHE Delft. And Emanuele, I would like to pass the microphone to you for the next phase of moderation.
Thank you. Thank you, Jean-Paul. Good morning from Delft, or good afternoon for the people that are joining from Far East. I see several names that sounds Indian, or from India, from Bangladesh. I'm excited. We are more than 100 in the room. So also good early morning to those who are joining from the Americas. I hope we have also some early birds morning over there. I see that there's already a discussion and wishes about celebrating and wishing Happy World Water Day to everyone. There is also someone wishing Happy Critical Water Day. And thanks for pointing that out there, because we started this, the idea of this webinar is to critically reflect on the theme of this year World Water Day, which is making groundwater visible, asking what kind of visibility are we advocating for, and what kind of visibility can indeed improve a more sustainable, fair, just management of groundwater. We will have 3 speakers in this first part of the panel that will end their presentation with a proposition. And so I invite all the audience, the public, to ask questions to the 3 speakers by using the Q&A question that you find on the bottom bar beside the chat and the participants icon. So there is a Q&A session. We will select at the end of each presentation a few questions, but the other, I think, can also be answered in written directly in this function. So let's start with Margreet, who is not only a colleague of mine and my boss here in Delft. She's also this year visiting fellow in Montpellier at the French Institute for Advanced Studies. And she's working exactly on a project called Caring Water Practices and Practicing Water Care, which is the title, more or less, of her presentation. Margreet, you have the floor.
Thank you, Emanuela. Let me share my screen. So before I start, it's important I want to say something in my presentation about why I think care and caring is important for groundwater governance. But before I start, it's important for me to point out that the stories that I'm referring to in my presentation are coming from the project that Jean-Paul already mentioned. The project is called Transformations to Groundwater Sustainability. It's a project that is funded by Belmont Forum Norway's program on transformations to sustainability. And the project brings together, the picture shows, researchers from many parts of the world, from India, Algeria, Morocco, Peru, Chile, California, Tanzania, Zimbabwe. And partly because of COVID, I myself have not been able to actually do any field visit or field research. So really, everything that I'm saying comes from the joint learning that we were forced to do online. So it's really, what I'm presenting is really the result of this joint learning. So I would like to start my presentation with 3 stories of groundwater use in agriculture, and I consider these stories as stories of caring for groundwater. So the first story is the story of Randulabad. And Randulabad is a community of around 2,000 people in Maharashtra. And the community has been collaborating with ACWADAM, so the organization of Himanshu, who will be speaking later. And ACWADAM has helped the community mapping their groundwater sources as a starting point for managing these resources more sustainably. What is interesting in Randulabad is that in the year 2000, the governing council of the community, of the village, decided to put a ban on borewells. This decision was importantly prompted by what the community saw happening in other villages, where they saw a depletion of groundwater levels and problems of equity and sustainability that were caused by it. So the community members jointly plan their agricultural activities according to water availability. And also the community is jointly involved in groundwater recharge activities, all with the help of ACWADAM. That's my first story. A second story of caring for groundwater comes from the desert coast of Peru. It's a story that the research for which has been done by Carolina Dominguez Guzman and Andres Verzel. Here on the desert coast of Peru, smallholder farmers dismiss the advice of the government to use pumps and drip irrigation for watering their mango trees. Trees that produce the mangoes that can be found in Dutch or French supermarkets. Smallholder farmers instead prefer using poças, a traditional irrigation method consisting of small ponds that store both canal and rainwater. These ponds also serve as rainwater harvesting and groundwater recharge devices. Poças are actually very old technologies. Chroniclers of the 16th century already make mention of it. They consist of basins, either diked or excavated, that capture water in times of abundance to prolong soil moisture availability and maintain groundwater levels after seasonal rains. So smallholder farmers, they stay with these poças because they consider them a more sustainable and reliable way of making use of available waters than pumps and tube wells and drip irrigation. There's much more to say about this, but perhaps one thing that I would like to mention is that they use poças not just for growing export crops, but also for growing subsistence crops. Then yet another story of groundwater care that I would like to share comes from a circular irrigation system in the Muzab Valley in the oasis of Algeria. Here it's a circular system, or it's called a circular system, because the system consists of collecting and then diverting the water from rare flash floods to the ancient oasis through channels that are called seguias. Part of the derived water is used to irrigate date palms on the basis of proportional water rights. The hydraulic structures used to capture and divert the water play a dual function. They not just divert and are used for water storage, but they also recharge the water table. So doing this can ensure availability of groundwater for at least 3 years. So even when these farmers in this oasis are under pressure to intensify their farming enterprises, there are groups of farmers who continue to invest considerable effort on holding on to this circular technology and to principles of circularity. And they value it precisely because they consider it more equitable and sustainable. So why am I sharing these stories? I'm sharing these stories and in our project, you can find more on our project website. We have collected many more of those stories. I think it's important to collect these stories to nuance and perhaps also challenge the tragedy of the common reasoning that pervades much writing on groundwater. This is the reasoning where users of groundwater appear as greedy individuals. They are individuals who are self-interested and who will continue pumping and over extracting groundwater unless stopped by regulations or laws, or those enforcing regulations and laws. It's a bit ironic here that this dominance of the tragedy of the commons logic in much groundwater governance literature, because the greed that regulations want to stop, at the same time is also actively encouraged by an emphasis on agricultural intensification, by hopes for increasing and improving agricultural productivity, by better linking farmers to markets, by promote all kinds of ways to turn farmers into profit-making entrepreneurs. So it's a bit ironic. On the one hand, greed is actively encouraged and supported, but on the other hand, it needs to be regulated and stopped when it comes to groundwater sustainability. So to come back, so it's interesting, the stories of caring for groundwater, I think, because these stories, in a way, show that the dominant narrative of the tragedy of the commons and of greedy individuals is not fully accurate or not always accurate. The stories show that there are also places and people and communities that are not just motivated by greed, but that are also motivated by solidarity, by concern for each other and for their environment. And so yes, they care actually. So it's important, I think, so these caring logic, or these practices of care, they sometimes come with ritualized forms of respect for each other and for the environment, and often they also form part of sentiments of belonging to territory or a connection to place. So my argument is that recognizing that this is so, and understanding when and why people engage in forms of care for groundwater are important. They're an important complement to, or perhaps sometimes a challenge to, stories of greed and almost unavoidable depletion. I think the continued existence of such forms of care and caring also shows that the active promotion of these forms of entrepreneurial logics is not always successful, and perhaps there's a bit of hope in that. So where does the idea of care come from? It has a long and feminist history, which I cannot go into, but just to say, to give a little bit of theory, caring for groundwater, the term care and ideas around caring, it draws together the emotional engagement of being concerned about groundwater quantities and qualities over time, and the practical engagement of wanting to contribute to restore or sustain groundwater levels or qualities, often as part of particular ways of relating and being. Another thing I really need to emphasize, that caring is never intrinsically good or politically neutral. For instance, if you look at the Muzab Valley, those who divert and store water may reduce the availability of water for those downstream, for instance. So the question, an emphasis on care, comes with the question. It comes with the question, can identified forms of caring represent or form the inspiration for more sustainable and equitable forms of groundwater governance? So my proposal then is that it's worthwhile and interesting to better recognize forms of care and to better value and perhaps support them. I think a more emphasis on care can perhaps also replace and sometimes challenge the emphasis on control, on accounting, regulation that is very dominant in approaches to thinking about water governance or groundwater governance. Perhaps a caring approach allows more room for experiments, careful experiments rather than masterful control, for surprises, for tinkering forms of making do. Beyond those directly involved in groundwater, an emphasis on care, I think, can perhaps also be an inspiration for those who study or groundwater or those who provide advice on groundwater governance. As for studying, groundwater situations are so incredibly diverse. This is something that I have, among others, learned from Himanshu, not just because of hydrogeological diversity, but also because of social, political, and cultural diversity, which means that every groundwater situation is intrinsically unique and specific. And that in turn means that comparing or generalizing needs to be done with care. It needs awareness of which frames are used and which concepts are, which axes of comparison are used, and it requires reflexive awareness of the political effects of these framings and assumptions. Careful comparison perhaps also means allowing more than one and actively encouraging multiple ways of generalizing. As for careful advice, rather than experts telling those engaging with groundwater on a day-to-day basis what to do and making assumptions about why they do what they do, I think more carefully advising would consist of joint forms of experimentation anchored in socio-natural specificities and will always be modest and pragmatic. This is where I will end. Perhaps just to reiterate, I think that more sustainable and equitable forms of groundwater governance cannot just come about by stopping behaviors or regulating behaviors that are considered bad, but should also consist in recognizing, valuing, and supporting behaviors that are considered good. So perhaps an emphasis on caring can provide a good basis for starting to do that, recognizing good groundwater behaviors and good groundwater relations.
Thank you very much, Margaret, for sharing your stories and also insight on both the theory and the practice of care in groundwater. And I think there is an interesting question by Patriwi Putri, I apologize if I don't pronounce the name properly, who's a postdoc at the University of Kassel, asking an interesting question. Can you care about groundwater also in urban context? Because your 3 stories were indeed about rural water. So, and they mention an example of Jakarta, where on the basis of that research, where indeed people seems not being put in having the possibility to care.
Yeah, it's a good question. And actually, I was immediately thinking of Jakarta because of, I've never been there, but I've learned from Bosman Batubara, who has showed me some very interesting initiatives of low-income communities that are threatened by floods. So it's not directly around groundwater, but it's related to groundwater because of how pumping groundwater creates subsidence and flood risk. So there is, I think, yes, of course, you can also do care for groundwater in urban areas, but perhaps in urban areas, pressures to, or perhaps the connection to groundwater or to and groundwater as part of the environment is a bit more, the distance is bigger. I don't know. But I think yes, in principle, yes.
Thank you. There's also a question in the chat. Please, if we can collect all the question in the other box, it's easier. But that's a question by Sumi. Very nice to meet. Nice to see you. It's a question about the so-called modest imaginaries. Do you really think that the so-called modest imaginaries, local and not big, can change this? Especially when it comes to groundwater depletion. What is indeed, what do you mean? Maybe also we need a clarification on what do we mean by modest.
Yeah. Well, what I mean with modest is that it seems, I don't know whether that's increasing, but it seems there is a tendency to speak about water and also water at the global level and treat it as a global phenomenon and make recommendations and advice at the highest global level, in a way unifying or commensurating all the diversity and the specificities of groundwater across the world. So for me, yeah, I can see the importance of that for generating a political awareness about the importance of groundwater, but I think it's a bit dangerous when it comes to help solve actual problems of groundwater in specific situations. So that is where I think more modesty is needed, and a bit sort of postponing the coming up with generic solutions or advice. Can this create the revolution, Sumit? I'm not sure. You're asking whether I'm optimistic, but I think I have the responsibility to be optimistic, or at least to cherish hope.
Maybe modestly optimistic. I think there is also one question by Helen Barbosa who asked how to leverage this non-grid community people technology that I imagine will be answered by Dr. Himanshu in his presentation. So I suggest to keep that for the end of our presentation, and maybe final clarification about the care as an holistic approach.
Care as a
holistic approach. Do you?
I don't know what that means.
Okay, so we will.
I'm not advocating a holistic approach, so I don't know what that means. Yeah. I'm advocating care as an entry point, and it's not to replace anything else. It's to complement, and it's an addition to what is already there. Sometimes a challenge, perhaps, but yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Margaret, for your presentation, for your answer. Maybe you can also have a look at the Q&A chat if you want to give more punctual answer to the people who are writing and asking more questions. In the meantime, I would like to move to our second panelist, who is François Molle, who is based at the Institute for Research and Development, l'IRD, in France. He has also a long experience, not only on irrigation groundwater, also on small dams across different continents, and is also the editor of the journal, co-editor of the journal Water Alternatives. François, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Emmanuel. I'll try to also share my screen. Do you see it full screen?
Yes.
Full screen, huh? Okay.
Yes, full screen.
Okay, so good morning, everybody. My presentation will be on groundwater overexploitation and the sheer difficulty to find adequate modes of governance to address this global problem. The global situation we are facing, well, I think is well known to all of us. It's a general drop in the water levels of major aquifers that are crucial to domestic water supply, but also irrigation, because I think if my memory don't fail, so around 40% of water in irrigation is sourced from groundwater. You see here groundwater depletion in the US illustrated on that chart. So it's now estimated at more than 1,000 billion cubic meter, even more now because that's 2008. So a very, of course, massive depletion of this particular groundwater resource. The impact, I think, is well known. I won't go in details, but just to illustrate the fact that groundwater depletion here around the small wetland of Azraq in Jordan has totally destroyed this incredible oasis sitting in the middle of the desert because of the irrigated agriculture that has been tapping this groundwater all around the wetland. Groundwater over abstraction also depletes river. This is a photo I took in a museum, desert museum in Arizona, where you see on the left the map of the perennial rivers at the end of the 19th century, and to the right the map as it is now. So groundwater pumping in these valleys has also depleted the base flow and the rivers of that particular environment. So let me now examine what kind of governance patterns could help in addressing that state of overexploitation. If I use this classic division of the three main modes of coordination in societies, main modes of governance, I will then successively look at community-centered governance, I will look at state-centered governance, and market-centered governance. I will then briefly talk about possible alternatives in terms of co-management. So if we look at the community groundwater management, we have well-known cases of community management of groundwater that include this canal system that probably all of us know, this near horizontal galleries that drain aquifers and which can be found between Morocco all the way to China. We also have instances of collective management of wells, but this is also a different matter. So these two cases should not be confused with the community management of aquifers themselves, of the resource. We do have a number of interesting cases worldwide, for example, coming from Yemen, from India, from Algeria, where communities have succeeded in establishing community rules about well spacing, the protection of a spring, the closing of disputed wells, regulating the expansion of the new wells, regulating the allocation of water in times of drought, and also quite a lot of cases about managing recharge that Himanshu and also Margreet have referred to. But if we, without discounting the importance of such experiences, whether this pure community groundwater groundwater management can be replicated is debatable. And we often find that these case studies refer to very specific social and ecological environment and are pretty hard to replicate at a wider scale, in particular on larger aquifers. We also find that the role of the state is sometimes difficult to separate from that of community groundwater management practices, that it's rarely the community itself, but that actually oftentimes the state also has a role in them. And we also find that these community rules are threatened by the variability of resource, hydrological variability, are threatened by technical changes, and in particular the spread of cheap pumping and drilling devices, and by the individual user strategies to expand agriculture. So without discounting again the importance of community management, it's hard to take that solution, if you want, as a solution for the global situation, in particular bigger aquifer. If we look at now market-driven aquifer management, that should not be confused also with these local water markets that famous in Pakistan, India in particular, which are actually markets about the service of pumping groundwater. So if we look at the instances of managing groundwater through water rights, we have a few cases basically coming from Chile, Australia, US, which also show different types of problems, in particular with monitoring and control of use in terms of factoring in the third-party impacts on third-party users or the environment, problems in terms of defining what is the overall entitlement, problems about threats of litigation, kind of legal issues. So this makes these cases also problematic in many ways, and not, well, it's market-driven, may have a role in some places, but it's hard to see that also as the solution. So if we move to state-centered groundwater management, and without entering into details in all the tools that the state can resort to basically control, first and foremost, the number and expansion of wells, but also to control the abstraction by existing well. Again, without entering into details, there's a lot of possible ways forward for states to make use of different tools. But all these tools are facing also big difficulty. They include huge logistical costs in getting information on what is going on in the field, who is drilling well, who is using water, how much. They face problem with corruption. They face problem with lack of means to enforce regulations. But they also, I would like to stress that, face not only logistical and difficulties and question of ability, they also face the lack of political will to address these situations of groundwater overdraft. Briefly, why there is such a pervasive lack of political will? First, there are powerful, influential persons often involved and benefiting from the groundwater economy. Morocco, Jordan, Peru, Mexico, there are many examples of such a situation. And these people are close to power and can influence the implementation of a regulation or the lack thereof. There are also conflicts between higher level state priorities. The state also has national priorities such as ensuring food self-sufficiency in terms of poverty alleviation, in terms of economic growth, and these different priorities often collide with resource conservation. There is also an issue of consolidating political power locally, political clienteles. The short-term political goals conflict with the long-term common good and sustainability. And there is also a bureaucratic competition behind that situation, where we see many times the agricultural ministry, for example, developing more plans to expand agriculture, irrigated agriculture, against sometimes the water or the environment or the energy sectors. Any success story? Well, again, I don't have time to enter in details, but there are some interesting issues from Japan, from the US, from China, Jordan, where interesting stories can be reported. In the interest of time, I will just try to typify two situations: a favorable context, which are countries where there is capital to augment supply, to substitute groundwater, typically in coastal urban context, where there is land subsidence, salinity intrusion, which are direct threats to assets of urban elites. This is typically California or Japan. Few bulk users, a regulatory capacity in terms of monitoring, enforcement. Agriculture is usually negligible, a strong legal backing. These are basically contexts where you can rebalance a situation of groundwater over abstraction. But the unfavorable context are contexts where you have a lack of human and financial means. You have a lack of state legitimacy and capacity to enforce law. A tendency to adopt stick-only measures and to overestimate the power of the state to really intervene on the ground. In such cases, agriculture predominates. You may have large numbers of users, tens or sometimes hundreds of thousands of users, and a host of political and economic private interests, which do not align with the longer term common good, if you want, which I just illustrated with a lack of political will. So in conclusion, a rather dismal situation when it comes to state intervention, with a very few examples where state capacity to achieve sustainable management has been able to reverse overdraft or to control illegal wealth. What we observe in general is a priority to supply augmentation, is top-down regulation, and ostrich-like strategies ignoring the problem which is building up. So let me turn now to what could be an alternative co-management of groundwater by the state and community. We could deduct from what I've just said that the three sort of classic types of governance don't really work. So maybe by default, a co-management between the states and community might work. So how to find the right mix? And do we have cases, of course, where we can observe this co-management? And what is the kind of mix between the state and the community? Of course, co-management can be about several things. Can be about co-understanding the hydrology, the resource that is available. It's the co-definition of the desired future condition. It's the co-definition of the quantitative targets, the reduction of use in times of drought, and it's also very much also about co-enforcement, how sanction, control, voluntary behaviors contribute to the enforcement of these rules. So we've identified 6 facilitating contextual factors, if you want, enabling conditions for co-management of groundwater to be successful, or at least to give the hope that this overdraft could be addressed. First is very also close to CPR research, the nature of the community, the question of the social capital, the question of the homogeneity of the social groups, the size of the group, its leadership. The second point is the existence of a credible threat that the state will use sticks. For example, a more restrictive system of entitlements is key to trigger some, if you want, inner sort of dynamics. But the state needs to have some levers, needs to have some environmental or legal levers to trigger that behavior. These levers in general will be environmental regulation that we see in the US, in EU, in Australia, but it can also be interstate agreements with the federal agreements in the US, dispute between the states, different states. Fourth, we need to have transparency in the data, in the modeling. This is very important to have scientific, transparent and shared basis about the availability of the resource itself. Importantly also is the need to have internal and external financial resource for the community in order to boost its autonomy and capacity to act. Last, there is a delicate balance, which is now, there's no, if you want, a silver bullet or ways to define exactly how to balance these things, but clearly there's a delicate balance between the carrots and the sticks, between the threats and the negative incentive that the state in particular can make use of, but also the benefits and the compensations that need to be extended to people. I think the few cases that we have really show that you cannot expect people to co-manage with the state the aquifer if it's only about threats and negative incentive. It's really about also the state, again, extending benefits, and more often than not, that includes financial subsidies to compensate for example, people who will accept to fallow during a particular season, for example. So that is also a very important point for the success of co-management. So in conclusion, we could, of course, again, there are important and also telling exceptions, but we can safely say that state-centered, purely state-centered governance is largely a failure worldwide. That instances of community management are quite rare and local, and also limited to a set of social and environmental requirements. We then saw that co-management is possible, but has many prerequisites. It's a solution, if you want, by default, but it needs an enabling context, which cannot be defined as a, if you want, a recipe that the community should do that and the state should be doing that. It really reflects each setting, which is different nature of the state, the different nature of the community, that will call for a distinct balance of sticks and carrots and roles of the community and roles of the state. I will end with that, Emmanuel.
Thank you very much, Francois, for pointing at some of the prerequisites needed for this co-management between different actors. about groundwater. We've been running a bit out of time, so I suggest the following, that I see one question for François, but I'm also curious to learn what Dr. Himanshu might think and say about this idea of co-management between the state and local communities. So may I suggest that we keep the, François, if you want to start having a look at the questions for you in the question box, and then we give now the floor to Dr. Himanshu, and then we come back for a Q&A session with both. Dr. Himanshu, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Emanuele, and good afternoon from here in Pune to everyone. Let me begin by sharing my screen, and let me know if you can see my screen, Emanuele.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Yes.
Like
Thank you. Yeah. So I will talk. I will actually pick up the thread from where Margreet and François left off, and they've sort of brought forth 2 or 3 very strong arguments for groundwater management and governance across the world. But my fundamental question is around the dichotomy of groundwater management and governance, which I think both the solution space that Margreet and François offered may resolve. So let me take a shot at my argument. I would sort of want to begin with going back to my own experience of the last 40 years when I began this journey on groundwater and where we are now. I mean, looking at groundwater through the ACWADAM lens of experiences. And I can say, and I'm going to sort of paraphrase this dominantly in the context of India. So I think we've had short temporal system of 3 phases in India when we look at groundwater. I mean, the 1970s, which was essentially a phase of groundwater resources development and involved gaining access to groundwater. The 1990s and 2000s, when groundwater management emerged as an alternative to the semantics of groundwater development, where essentially we talked of conservation, improved water use efficiencies, and all of those arguments that go with actions on groundwater usage. And more recently, the globally evolving paradigm on groundwater governance, which I strongly feel gets restricted by arguments around regulation. So as symbols of these 3 phases, I've actually got pictures. So the first picture is about a drilling rig moving from one village to the other in India, going back, I think this is from the 1980s. The second is the big push for conservation, watershed management, harvesting of water, and consequently recharge. And the third is the evolving area of groundwater legislation, as François pointed out, through state instruments of laws and rights and entitlements, and so on and so forth. I also want to make the second argument, which is really about it's about the sources of water. And on this particular day, I am actually saying that groundwater is now visible more than ever before. So 40 years ago, the visibility of groundwater was very limited. Today, we have technology, we have access, which itself makes the resource visible. We have a lot written in science. There's a lot of research. And I think by increasing the use of groundwater, as users, we have more experience. And therefore, on this day where we actually have a slogan on making visible the invisible, I want to put forth the argument that today, groundwater is more visible than ever before. And therefore, the question, are we better off in managing it, in governing it? I think the answers are obvious from both the previous presentations. But let me sort of take this one step further, and which is India, which is, if you sort of bring a lot of the statistics together, the context of groundwater is in India is at least 1 billion Indians use groundwater every day in some way or the other. And that's a huge groundwater footprint. But the footprint itself is significantly variable because dependencies, vary, are diverse. The spectrum of dependency is actually quite wide. From a rain-fed farmer who taps into shallow groundwater through a small well to sustain his family when they live on the farm to cultivate the single crop of paddy, which is rain-fed, to farmers who have run out of groundwater in their fields and run to the river channel to almost sort of pick up the immediate recharge to these wells, which offer fresh water, which offer water for longer periods of time. And then they transport water from these wells to their farms, maybe 6-7 kilometers away. That's in some way the spectrum of dependence. Now the crisis, data tells us, the Central Groundwater Board data in India, which looks at periodic assessments, actually brings together the question of overexploitation of groundwater and the question of contamination. I mean, it's just that, and ACWADAM has put together some of this data to come up with a hybrid vulnerability map, which shows that roughly 60% of the districts in India are under some level of vulnerability from depletion or contamination. So in order to sum up the crisis, we can say that it's around 4 basic elements which are obvious, which data is telling us. The question of aquifer depletion, the question of groundwater contamination and the nuances of groundwater contamination, the link to ecosystem, especially with the drying up of springs, with the drying up of rivers, reduced base flows in our rivers, streams and rivers. But I think the obvious components of the crisis often hide the larger picture, which is the social picture, which is the picture of competition, the inherent competition between users, the conflict between users, the deepening of inequities, the large-scale marginalization of the marginalized. And I often say this to a lot of people, that the marginalization at aquifer boundaries, for example, is really about social marginalization. And like Margaret alluded to, this is happening across a very, very diverse socio-hydrogeological setting. Now, having said that, if we look at moving forward, and there is now an increasing fashion, I would say, in India, in the policy corridors of India, to look at solutions outside, to look at solutions in the developed world. Now, when I look at this argument, I think about India as being, 160 million hectares of arable land area, gross irrigated crop area of over 80 million hectares as the largest in the world. Add to this about 5,700 towns and cities, which are growing, some of them bursting at the seams, so to say. And then when we actually bring land holding across continents to this argument of, what do we take from the West? What do we take from developed regions? One of our big problems is the land holding issue. And India's land holdings are not only small, they are getting smaller by the day. Hence, we have more users and users to govern. So keeping that at the back of our mind, I would like to sort of now bring the argument back to the continued largest of groundwater resources development from where we began in the 1980s, which is really about what I have, sort of found a very interesting issue of semantics. The focus on sourcing, the focus on access, and the focus on distributing the water from the sourced and access points. So it's, in some ways, it's the sad story of groundwater in India, which summarizes the largest of groundwater resources development. And despite efforts, which still continues unabated in terms of atomistic sourcing, the nanoscales of access, and the supply-dominated distribution system. So having said that, fundamentally, I want to pose one question, which is groundwater resources development, as it was in the 1980s, continues unabated. And we have two new paradigms. Well, not new in that sense, but two new paradigms on which people tend to discuss things. One is the question of participatory groundwater management. And therefore, how can community decision that has led to some kind of collective action be, insulated from externalities because of limited groundwater governance options. So for example, in the upper picture, you can see that people come together at a fairly small scale. So you have a water user group, or you even have a village in which people have accepted certain norms whereby their footprint on groundwater usage has reduced. But the aquifer then extends beyond this user group, and you get into a classical free riding situation. And these are practical elements that I, as a practitioner working in the field, see every day. So does groundwater governance today address the issue of externalities? And the second, when it comes through the policy trajectory, it's really about framing laws. It's about, actually creating acts. It's about trying to address the groundwater development largest through the question of environmental laws as somewhat external to classical groundwater regulation. And most of the regulation that I see has very limited provision for catalyzing community action and for sustaining such action. So I actually see a dichotomy between these two trajectories. And to make it even more sort of glaring, let me offer these 2 points of view purely from a person who has experienced both these sides. So the practitioner view, the kind of work that Margreet alluded to in her presentation in the 3 case studies, is people frame sort of certain norms, but these are users on the ground who use groundwater day in and day out. And they have a certain view on things. So you arrive at a situation where people come together, there's collective action, there is participation, it's based on demystified science, all of that on one side. But this particular group views groundwater governance as a larger, as a part of the larger context of groundwater management. So the practitioner's view actually looks at groundwater governance as one part of their overall canvas. On the other hand, the policymaker perspective looks essentially at rules, regulations, punishment, incentives. And the picture is somewhat different, that groundwater management should be part of the larger context of groundwater governance. Now, it really is an either-or context today. How do we make these two inclusive of each other? And for that, I want to conclude with my last slide. So the integration of groundwater management and governance is really about 5 Ps. Again, as a practitioner, not so much as a researcher, but as a practitioner who's dealing with some of these issues on a day-to-day basis, and across the very, very diverse context of groundwater in India, from managing springs in the higher Himalayas to managing groundwater in sort of the villages of drought-starved Marathwada in Maharashtra. I see that the 5 Ps are extremely important. I think it's really about principles, values and norms around aquifers as CPR. And I like the way Francois actually sort of brought in his last argument that community management of groundwater and community management of aquifers might be somewhat different. In fact, they are somewhat different. So how do we get to the latter without endangering the values from the former? Second, I believe unless there is a huge change in human behavior, we will never be addressed the tensions, competition, and conflict around groundwater. As a matter of fact, even recognizing that there is a brewing conflict is important. And without people, it's going to be extremely difficult to meet these challenges. Now, for people to come together, for people to change their behavior, we need processes. And processes cannot be top-down, cannot be, processes that are siloed in the 3 boxes of science, praxis, and policy. I think it's about data gathering, it's about data-based community decisions. So it's really about getting communities to sit together, to talk to each other, to discuss, to decide. That will lead to some kind of collective action. And collective action, I believe, as a practice has become imperative, not so much in the classical manner of a water users group or a water users association, but going beyond those boundaries, both metaphorically as well as realistically, beyond the boundaries of a village or a town or a small community. And I think those practices must embody a lot of community level decision and action. And last but not least, again, taking off from what both Margreet and Francois alluded to, can we think of a different kind of policy making? Something which is not top down, something which is more catalyzing, enhancing, embracing, and which looks at securing and sustaining good practices rather than focusing narrowly on securing water or securing food, which I think in India, communities are enabled enough to do. So with that, I would like to sort of say thank you by also, half a minute on the work that we do at ACWADAM. So we are trying to bring the concept of aquifers closer to the concept of communities and community usage. And we find that the contexts are very different. Thank you, Margreet, for actually pointing me to that diversity is not really about hydrogeological diversity or aquifer diversity alone. It's about how that diversity is overlain by, layers, the social layer, the economic layer, the environmental layer. And I think it's really the concept of partnership and collaboration that will help us arrive at this interplay of science and society where groundwater is concerned, particularly in India, but I believe also extending that argument to many, many other parts of the world. So thank you very much. And over to you, Emanuele.
Thank you very much, Dr. Himanshu, for sharing not only along your experience about the trajectory of groundwater management and governance in India, but also, I think, an important lesson about methodology in terms of producing and applying knowledge on groundwater. I'm afraid that we have to manage this space with the next session, and we've been running out of time, but I think time was needed to get all these very interesting and important insight and reflection. So I would suggest the following. We now give the space to the roundtable, and in the meantime, we let Dr. Himanshu presentations and ideas sediment in the Q&A chat box, and I will collect and pack the questions for Dr. Himanshu and also for Francois Molle in a final session. We had initially 10 minutes allocated for final remarks by Margreet, but I hope that she will be happy to share those 10 minutes with the three speakers to allow also a final reflection on what we learned about from the interactions of the different presentations. So please write your, to the audience, write your questions for Dr. Himanshu or Francois Molle, if you still have, in the Q&A chat box. And while I give back the microphone to Jean-Paul for chairing the roundtable discussion.
Thank you so much, Manuele, and thanks a lot for these really wonderful and insightful presentations. So now we will start with the roundtable, and I expect a lot of interaction to happen. I would actually like to invite all of the panelists and the discussants to turn on their webcams. And let's try to create this roundtable session. And I would like to introduce our discussants. So today with us, we have Dr. Hind Ftouhi. She's a postdoctoral researcher from the Centre de Recherche d'études sur les sociétés contemporaines in Morocco. And she's working on several research projects looking at issues of groundwater in North Africa. Together with us, we also have Dr. Melle Nikkels. He is a postdoc and a postdoctoral researcher and a consultant, recently graduated with a PhD on issues of groundwater governance at Wageningen University. And he's working very actively in the Dutch landscape, also in collaboration with farmers and stakeholders on the ground. So combining both academic and hands-on experience. Together with Melle, we are joined by Willem Grootoonk, apologies for the bad pronunciation of your last name, who's the chair of the Youth Environmental Council in the Netherlands, and who is also someone that has extensive research, extensive experience in water management. And we're also very fortunate to have today with us Ms. Bettina Deuser. Welcome. She is the head of the unit of sustainable freshwater management at the DG Environment in Brussels, the European Commission. So we're extremely happy to also have this opportunity to invite you here with us. So the rules of our roundtable are simply the following. I will invite the first discussant to react, and then the panelist may as well give some feedback to her reactions. The only limit that we have is time, so we will try to keep this quite concise, and I'll try to be quite tight with time management. So thank you very much, Hind Ftouhi. Please, I would like to invite you to share your reactions.
Thank you, and first of all, I would like to thank you for allowing me to participate in this such important event. I listened to the three presentations with great pleasure and interest. They were very inspiring and full of lessons. And one of the presentations and proposition particularly spoke to me and connects to the work that my colleagues and I carrying out in the southeast of Morocco. Indeed, in Morocco, for several years, we have been witnessing the implementation of an agricultural development model based on an intensive use of groundwater and the promotion of high value added crops that lead to an extension of the irrigation frontiers. And I would like to give just a short example of the Dar'a Valley in the southeast Morocco. In fact, the arid climate in the valley has made water a scarce resource, and groundwater was considered for a long time as a simple resource to supplement surface water in dry years and during the summer. However, toward the end of the 20th century, access to land, but also to groundwater, has allowed the establishment of new agriculture extensions and has led to the emergence of new forms of agriculture around the ancient oases. In these ancient oases, agriculture is characterized especially by a subsistence farming, whereas in the extensions, mostly high-value crops are grown for which groundwater is central and essential. Thus, in addition to food crops, other high-value added crops have been introduced. And in these extensions, watermelons were introduced around the year 2000 and then adopted by different categories of farmers. I can mention large local farmers, investors, or stranger investors who came from outside the region because they are attracted by the profitability of this crop. But also there is young local farmers who grow the watermelons. And these different categories of farmers exploit the land and the groundwater resources according to different logics. So this dynamic has been encouraged by Moroccan agriculture development strategy, which has encouraged investments in extensions by providing subsidies for the installation of drip irrigation systems, but also the installation of water basins in which the pumped up groundwater is stored. Thus, over the years, the area of land cultivated with watermelons has rapidly increased, and this has been accompanied by the digging of more and more wells and holes. For example, sometimes we find in the same farm that there are up to 4 wells, and sometimes when the water runs out on one plot, the producer or the farmers looks for another plot. And this extraction of groundwater resources is similar to which we can call a mining process. And this situation has led to a drop in the level of the groundwater table. And according to official sources, the water table has dropped by 15 to 40 meters between 1980 and 2020. So, to cope with this situation, local young farmers have launched initiatives to reduce the area cultivated with watermelons and thus reduce the amount of irrigation water mobilized. In 2020, these young farmers introduced a rule that each farmer could only grow 2 hectares of watermelon annually, making it unattractive for large farmers using much of the groundwater to settle in the area. So, in 2021, the situation appears to have been successful, as farmers estimate that the total area under watermelon has decreased. But they remain skeptical about the future of this collective action and also about the future of watermelon in these extensions. Because this year, fewer farmers comply with this rule. In addition, the region is experiencing another year of drought. However, so beyond the success of the failure of this collective action, this example provides information of the awarenesses of local people of the potential threats to the groundwater, but they are also aware that mining groundwater could compromise the sustainability of their agricultural activities, their livelihoods, and also have negative effects on the environment, especially in a context marked by climate change, recurrent droughts, and deteriorating water quality that is becoming increasingly saline. Thus, These initiatives can serve as an example for thinking about more sustainable and more sensitive models of agricultural development, but also a model of groundwater governance in terms of the impact of agricultural activity on the environment. This initiative is also an illustration of possible alternative of groundwater governance, which is expressed locally and which describe this logic of caring, but also of sharing as process of groundwater management. So thank you.
Thank you so much. I would like to see if there is anyone here that wants to react to your reactions. Also the panelists are obviously invited to join the conversation. If you feel any of the comments of Dr. Ftouhi were relevant, or otherwise, for the sake of the time, I would like to pass the microphone to Dr. Nikkels.
Thank you, Champel. I will share with you some of my Dutch experiences, and I go from I see a link with collective care, but also with favorable context and the 5 Ps. So I wonder if I can put that all in my story. Many of you might know the Netherlands from being a low-laying, very wet country, but that's not always and everywhere the truth. We have clay soils, but we also have sandy soils, and especially in the dry summers of 2018, 19, and 20, yeah, we really suffered from droughts. And we are here in the Netherlands very much looking to collaborate, learn together, to improve what we call the sponge capacity of our landscapes. And this means that the government, or the government bodies that are responsible for water management here, and land users, aka farmers, work together to take care of our water system. And many farmers see themselves as custodians. So when Margreet was talking about caring, I think a lot of them are very willing to take action, not only for their own enterprise or business, but also for the system, or whatever you may view as system. However, yeah, we are a bit stuck. And I want to share with you why. And I also would really like to see what your critical thinkers, what you can add to my story, or what your comments are. Because I work for a consultancy company, and most of the time we are a bit the middleman. So we facilitate co-management between governments and farmers. And what happens is that farmers and policymakers start off and trying to explore what farmers can do to improve the water system. And this is mostly trying to store rain as locally as possible, so in their soils and in the farmers' ditches. And then there's a lot of governance questions, of course, about responsibility, about roles. Now, Francois was mentioning carrot and sticks. This is very often the sort of topics that we discuss. However, there is one thing that that I found out that we really lack, and both farmers and the various levels of governance acknowledges this, because there's many legal questions that we have not been looking at in the Netherlands. And one of these legal questions is, we see water as a res nullius. This means that it belongs to nobody and to everyone. But if you as a landowner or as a farmer try to do everything you can to store more water, to allow more water to seep through to groundwater, who owns this water then? Is that yours, or does it belong to the system? And if you take that out of the legal context, would you then be allowed to pump it up when you store water in the summer or water in the winter? Would you then be allowed to pump up water in the summer, even if that's obviously not exactly the same water, but it's about quantities? This is a big challenge where our water boards, the sort of the governance layer that is responsible for our water management, is really struggling with. And another very important question that only comes up after trying and tinkering care, as Margreet called it, is who is responsible if it goes wrong? Let's say we have a big rain event, and one farmer is trying to do his very best to improve the system with all these various local measures. There's a big rain event, there's a flood because of these measures, and the neighbor is suffering from it. That's of course a legal question that is very much hampering upscaling local measures, cooperation, and collective care. And I know that collective care is very context specific, but I was wondering, Mr. Himanshu, if the 5 P's that you mentioned, shouldn't that be 5 P's plus 1 L, and that is a useful legal framework?
Yes, you want my response to that?
Yeah, well, I know I can re-ask the question. Where and how do legal questions such as this one, who owns water, who is responsible for it goes wrong, fit in the various forms of water views on water governance? And where does these legal, let's say, you can call it you can call it a boundary object or whatever, the playing field, which is the legal framework, fit in the 5 P's?
Yeah, so I think for very practical purposes, I did not separate out the legal question from the 5 P's, fundamentally because I think in India, we simply don't have a very robust framework to begin with. We are still struggling on how groundwater legislation should be made. But to make it short, I have actually brought it into the policy frame. And I actually see a bit of a conflict between the P, which represents policy, and the L that you've brought up, which represents the legal framework. And it actually goes back to a lot of the points you made about the ownership of water, even the ownership of recharged water. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, point completely taken that the legal framework is important, but I think the legal framework has to run through all the 5 P's in some ways.
Okay.
Thanks a lot. Thank you so much, Melle, and thank you so much, Himanshu. I will abuse of my role of moderator here to also add a comment in terms of the discussion on the legal framework. Clearly, this is something that has been addressed both in policy and in theory in the field of governing the commons. Obviously, the work of Elinor Ostrom here comes to mind. But I think that there is also another very important theoretical perspective that is the one of moving from a theory of property to a theory of access. And in that sense, makes me think about the work of Ribot and Nancy Peluso, the famous paper Theory of Access, which I think it's something that maybe has not been connected that directly with issues of groundwater governance. And I'm after this seminar, I'm really curious to go back to that paper and see what type of connections can emerge. So certainly, Mel, I agree with you. There is the legal aspect is a fundamental one, but not everything is disciplined by law, and very often that also depends on the type of system that is in place. We also tend to impose north-centric, capitalistic legal systems over other types of customary legal systems, for example. So also that is something that needs to be handled with care.
I agree with you, Jean-Paul, that there's many sort of questions around what well, in 5 minutes, tried to share. And it is about access and collaborating. And if you have a common water, how to allow for everybody to have a share and do that really sustainably. But what I really found in the Netherlands, that it also is the other side. So we have a water board as a government body that is responsible for a water system legally. However, they're not responsible for, they're mostly responsible for protecting us, not for drought. And what they're really sort of afraid of in trying to, that is in a way, it's hampering a collective care, is that they are also responsible for if a neighbor suffers. So if there is a flood or too much water because of you're trying to store water, then we don't know what to do. It's not, we have no law written that says this is where we, which I find, yeah, very interesting. And we only found out by tinkering. So I like that word of Margreet.
And what is happening in North Europe and in the Netherlands clearly is bringing up new challenges.
Yeah.
So of course, we are also seeing a changing environment, hydroclimatic change, which is creating new governance challenges, clearly. And to get some more experiences from, I guess, from the Dutch perspective, I would like to now invite Willem.
Yes, thank you. And thank you to all the speakers thus far. It was very interesting to listen to all your talks. I think I can mostly add on this interaction between policy and community engagement and the interface between them, and often the challenge of finding that community engagement in making new policy. Specifically for my own working field, which is youth, so younger people within the Netherlands. And with my board, I try to work on like environmental issues in a broader sense, so water also falls under that. And in that, we really try to engage with the younger population of the country and create visibility about the topic. But then we always also very quickly notice that visibility is not the only step that is necessary, because often when you create visibility, you still notice that there's a very lacking response to it. And then there's a very easy conclusion to be made: the youth simply doesn't care. But that is too easy, and it's also too shorthand. And I think what we learned throughout the years is that's often just very hard to get yourself in the right mindset to engage with youth. So I guess this also applies to the community management practices we've seen in the presentations, but it's really important to kind of look at the local context, and especially also consider your own context as someone who has experience in environmental sciences. It's very easy to get stuck in this bubble of explaining things a certain way that just simply does not find engagement with younger people that might care about the topic, but not might care about the topic in the way you present it. However, how challenging it is to move beyond just explaining things to older people, to stakeholders. I think it can be very valuable to try to involve youth in the policy-making process as well, and also in the community engaging process. Simply because, first of all, in the quest for making inclusive policy, we also need to include young people, because they make up a certain, quite a large part of the population, actually. They're just usually not as vocal as those that are a bit older than them. Or maybe not as vocal, they're just less noticed. And I think the mere process of trying to convert and to explain something for youth can really be a reflective experience. And it can also offer a lot of value in creating policy that is inclusive to a very broad audience, and that is also very much non-academic, for example. And in this way, I think I would like to call for more youth participation in environmental policy. It's because maybe adding to this, I think what we experience when we go to schools or when we talk to young people is that they really think out of the box. They're not limited by the same financial incentives. They're not limited by, I guess, the burden of knowledge, you could call it. They often just say things, and it's very easy to say, that's a too easy idea, of that's not practical implementable. But sometimes, if you look at it closely, there's really a kernel of truth in it, and you can take that further. And this can really lead to newfound insights and impressions. And most importantly, they often don't suffer from the same, they usually don't have their own financial incentives in whatever you're doing. So they're not as likely to go on the defensive because they have their own farm, or they have their own water use in their garden, for example. And additionally, I think it's also youth do care a lot about their own future, of course. And if you start now by trying to engage them in the policy process, you'll also have an important start to keeping them with the policy as they grow older, because in the end, the youth will be the ones implementing a lot of water policy, and they'll also be the ones dealing with a lot of the issues that are developing now. So I think in many ways, it's better to implement them now already in community engagement programs than to kind of leave them on the side, because the adults will handle this for the youth, so to say. And in this sense, I think personally, I'm a youth myself, so I might be a bit biased, is that involving youth in policy making and trying to find this discussion between the development of policy and the incentives of young people and what young people think about this policy can be incredibly worthwhile in future-proofing your policy, but can also right now lead to maybe insights into that policy that you would never have considered, simply because you're, I guess, stuck in your own bubble of environmental knowledge that maybe just not thinking in that paradigm can burst.
Thanks a lot, Willem. And yeah. And I think like this is a perfect segue to pass the microphone to Miss Bettina Döser. Very, very grateful for you to be with us today, head of the unit of sustainable freshwater management at the DG Environment. Welcome, and we are happy to take your reaction.
Thank you very much. Good day from Brussels to everybody. And first of all, happy World Water Day, and many thanks for this initiative. I'm really sorry I missed all the interesting presentations because I was actually in another commitment, but it is a very important day, and I'm very happy that I am invited to your event as well. You mentioned I am in charge of water policy in the European Commission, but more the EU dimension. So I'm learning and I'm listening to you with a lot of humility, because I'm really no expert in the specific problems in our partner countries. I know, of course, and you know, that the EU is reaching out, including on water. We have partnerships with especially India and China to discuss water issues. And I'm just really happy to see that there's also this concrete opportunity to discuss very concrete situations and problems. So today is World Water Day, and our Commissioner for the Environment, Commissioner Sinkevičius, has lined up with our external High Representative, Mr. Borrell, and they've issued a statement. You can find this in the press at the occasion of World Water Day. And in this, they remind us how precious our water resources are, how much they deserve to be managed sustainably, and how much water also plays a role in conflict, unfortunately, as we know. And we've been reminded in Europe very brutally just a few weeks ago with this terrible situation that is in Ukraine after the Russian invasion, that has a huge impact also on the Ukrainian water bodies, some of which are, of course, shared across borders with the rest of Europe. So we are trying to do whatever we can there, but this is not today's topic. What I wanted to say is that our politicians remind us how important water governance is, how much it can be a solution, including to conflicts and to a contribution to peace. So in the EU, as you may know, we have a quite sophisticated legal environment to govern our water, and our legal environment also includes directly a governance structure. So since we are celebrating especially our groundwater resources today, I just wanted to mention that we have a specific EU legislation, a so-called Directive on groundwater. This is part of a family of water legislation that deals with water management more generally, and in particular also pollutants, that is separate legislation, and groundwater bodies. We look at groundwater in terms of its quality, so what pollutants are in there, and we also look at it in terms of quantity. Are our groundwater resources in good quantitative status or not? On that front, luckily, the last measurements have been rather positive, and more positive than on the quality side, where we look in particular at chemical pollution. But this being said, we of course feel the impacts of climate change, as you have also mentioned, that you feel them in your countries, and this is a very big impact. And Europe is reflecting on how it can become more resilient. So maybe just to remind us that we are actually all attending a so-called satellite event of the Climate Pact, which is a grassroots initiative to practically find solutions, to engage, to come together to discuss. And water is a huge part in that. I don't know how many of you are aware of our bigger political project, the so-called European Green Deal, which leads the EU to carbon neutrality. This Green Deal declines into separate initiatives that deal with particular policy areas and their interconnections. There is a climate adaptation and resilience strategy, and water, for very good reasons, has a very prominent role in that. So maybe just to come back to the governance structure that we have, including on groundwater, which may serve as an example, and I know this is also being discussed in these partnerships that we have. In our water legislation, member states are required to submit planning documents where they explain how they will deal with the water resources, how they will make sure that they get into what we call good status, including in the case of groundwater, this good quantitative and chemical status. Today is not only World Water Day, but also a very important day for European water management, because today is the deadline by which our member states have to report these next planning documents to us. They do them in 6-year cycles. So today we expect from our member states their reportings for their so-called river basin management plans and also their flood risk management plans. Because as the Dutch colleagues have, of course, pointed out to us, we in Europe struggle as much with too little water as we struggle with too much water. And for both of these, our governance structures foresee certain mechanisms to plan for the risk and to plan on how to manage this. Maybe a word on outreach. So in our legislation, it is required to have public consultations to involve everybody who is concerned by water management. And then our member states, of course, have their specific structures in addition. So you mentioned the Dutch water boards, for example. Many member states do this differently, but they all come together under these requirements for public engagement and public involvement. By the way, our transboundary river basins do the same. So they also engage across national borders about their shared water resources and their shared rivers. And then since water is such a specific challenge, also in wake of climate change, in addition, we have these other outreach possibilities like the Climate Pact and the more general outreach possibilities you've mentioned, that you are engaged with youth, Mr. Grootoonk. We have, as you know, the European Year of Youth this year, and maybe this is also a possibility for you to link up and to draw attention to the cause of water. This would be, of course, highly welcome. We have also an ongoing process more generally on the governance structure of Europe, the so-called Conference on the Future of Europe, and in their climate and climate adaptation plays a huge role as well. So their citizens have also come together to make concrete suggestions on how to deal with these problems. So I'm once again very happy to be with you today to hear about your concrete situations in your countries, and maybe to compare a little bit, and in the end to conclude that we really share very common challenges in water management, and there may be best practice examples that we could share more also on both sides. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Ms. Döser. This is really a demonstration of how science policy interface interactions are extremely useful, and I would love to have more of this organized with NEWAVE. So thank you very much. And now we're heading towards the end of our session, but I would like to invite all of our panelists to turn on their webcams, and you as well as are welcome to keep your webcams on, so we can show. And Caterina Marinetti, our scientific project manager, also can show up. She's been shy behind the scenes. And I would like to pass it to Alphonse, of course, other person without whom we would have not been able to organize this session. And I don't see Emanuele. Ah, there you are, Emanuele. So Emanuele, maybe we can moderate this final 7 minutes of wrap up. And I will leave it to you if you like.
Yes, thank you. I think while we are meeting online, but I think that Fons has to leave and to go on land for a cleanup initiative, which has been organized by European Climate Pact Netherlands. So good luck for that cleanup, which I think will take place in The Hague, if I remember well. Thanks for joining, Fons. And now I'm in the difficult position to summarize all the very interesting questions that have been asked to our panelists. But then I will put our panelists in an even more difficult position, because they will have to answer the question in a very short closing remark. And there were two types of questions. The first, some questions which are related to specific case studies, like there was someone asking about groundwater in India or solutions for groundwater in the Mekong River. And I suggest that those are very complex issues, and but there's plenty of material, study, research done by the different projects that are here. So my suggestion would be, and request for the speakers and the panelists would be to share with the people who asked on the chat resources and additional material linked to website where they can find indeed more information and ideas. And the two requests were about China and groundwater in China and in the Mekong Basin. And I would like to conclude by asking a question around inequality and the role of and place of inequality in groundwater management. And in particularly, so starting from Dr. Himanshu, and because there were also some questions that are indeed related to the role of inequality and conflict of interest and inequality and discrimination among communities, but also within communities. How do they play in the groundwater? Then, in groundwater governance. Then to Francois, a comment on this big issue on inequality and conflict or competing interest, by looking in particular at the role of the private sector or market logics, the role of the supply chain in this co-management between the state and the community. And finally, to Margaret, there was indeed the request to elaborate more on how she sees from the gender perspective this issue of care, and again, a different type of inequality and power relation. So we do it the reverse order. We start with Himanshu, then Francois, and finally Margaret.
Thank you, Emanuele. I will just allude sort of try and answer that question on three fronts. First and foremost, we must remember that inequalities are a result of both hydrological, climate, that the natural part, and social elements, social parts, socioeconomic aspects. So I think inequalities result due to a combination of these, or a compounding of these two sides of these two sides of groundwater. Second, it has many, many dimensions, and I think it's difficult for me to address those dimensions in the short time I have. But I would like to end by actually posing inequality, or the sort of the challenges in inequality and the importance of addressing inequality as something which I rate far, far above questions of efficiency and sustainability. Although these are interlinked, I think the solution space must have a very strong element of equitability. I don't like the word equity because it's often used in finance in a very different way. So I prefer the word equitability. And I think bringing equitability to the context of efficient management of groundwater and sustainable governance is perhaps a message that we need to spread across the board in taking this whole process forward. So I'll end with that.
Thank you, Himanshu. So not only visibility, governability, but also equitability. I like this new word. Thank you. Francois.
Yes, Emmanuel. Yeah. Well, your question really is about the where is the private sector in that community state? And indeed, when we talk about that co-management, then it's a good question. Where is this big investor that Hind, for example, illustrated for Morocco? And that's, I would say, that's where the state has a role in managing not only the relationship with the community, but the overall resource. And indeed, I mean, the cases we have from Latin America, from the Mediterranean and beyond, of big investors reappropriating a resource that oftentimes is already used, is precisely because the state is not managing the resource in an equitable and legal framework, or also I would say just and end with that in a hydrologically sound manner. And there are many examples, because there was a question on the Mexicali Valley, so many examples where fuzziness about the circulation of water, and that's take us to our theme of making it visible, because it's invisible, fluctuating, oftentimes the reappropriation of water is allowed by the lack of comprehensive taking into account of the hydrology, which happened really in the Imperial Valley in the US and this Mexicali Valley, where the Mexican were, well, anyway, it's a long story. But then I think it's really, yeah, the question, my answer is the state has to provide the wider framework in which private sector, whatever big or small, is also considered as a user, and therefore it's the management of the whole resource that matters.
And there would be more with the carrot or the stick?
Well, it's a stick in the sense that you should restrict access to the aquifer, and so that's a constraint for everyone. But this is precisely because very few governments or very few agencies locally get to the point of defining, how much we can pump. And even if you do, then there's a question of how you control, who is actually pumping what. But so this difficulty of doing that opens the way for, people to come in and just tap the resource as like others. So, yeah.
Thank you, Francois. And Margreet, what do you want to add?
Thank you, Emanuele. Yeah, care from a gender perspective. There's so much to say about this, but let me just say it starts, I think, with staying away from essentialist assumptions about women being better carers or women being better at care. But of course, it does at the same time. It is very much based on the recognition that in many societies, a lot of work that is considered as care work or that is labeled as care work, work of food provisioning, work of caring in the traditional health sense, work of cleaning, etc. All that work is considered women's work. So there is that clearly, and it's also in most societies, it is work that is not generally seen or considered as important as so-called productive work. It's associated with the reproductive sphere. It's often not paid or paid much less. So indeed, a revaluation, recognition of care work in that sense is important and is a feminist move. How it relates to groundwater, I think that's an empirical question. I would be hesitant to make generalistic statements about that. And beyond this, I think it's important to realize that the very association of the feminine women with care is also performative, in the sense that it makes it more difficult to recognize that men also often care. And there is a lot of care work that men do, but sometimes to be seen as real men find it difficult to acknowledge for themselves and for others that they are involved in care work or to take pride in care work. So that is a different level that I think that is important for groundwater. And I think at yet another level, even what scientists do is partly defined through this care control dichotomy, with science being seen as about being in command, especially the engineering natural sciences. So there is also that. So I think it's also an attention to care in that sense invites also a reconsideration and reflection about what science is about, and recognizing that many scientists, although they take more pride in their control and command of numbers, many of them actually are very caring, and what they do in groundwater is about they are concerned and it's about caring, and recognizing this, I think, is also part of this agenda.
Thank you very much, Margreet. I particularly appreciate this ending with also science and scientists are as care and carer. And I think you gave a beautiful illustration of that in your presentation when you show those beautiful drawings to illustrate your stories, and which indeed is the medium telling also a message. I think the drawings are made by Christian Olmos Herrera. I would like to greet because he's also among the participants in the audience. And which leads me to my final request, because so what's next and how we can continue the conversation. I would suggest that to share in the chat all website, for instance, the website of NEWAVE, where you can also register to the monthly newsletter to get informed about future initiatives. The website of Transformation to Groundwater Sustainability, where you can find more drawings, but also podcasts and other resources to further care about groundwater. Maybe, Francois, we can also share the Water Alternatives platform, because indeed, when it comes to groundwater and groundwater visibility, it's not easy to find good images, but Water Alternatives not only is a scientific journal, they also have a repository and archive of photos, which are freely available. So if we can share, and please take note of all these addresses so that we can indeed continue our conversation. And having said so, I would like to thank again all the panelists and the audience for their interaction, and I will give back the floor to Jean-Paul and Caterina for final remarks and the closing.
Thanks so much, Manuel. I think we covered everything, and I'm really thankful to all of you for the participation and for the initiative. So I will not repeat all of the names of the people that made this possible, but thanks so much to everyone. I don't know if Caterina wants to say something to close up the event.
Thank you, Jean-Paul. Yeah, I think both you and Manuel wrapped it up pretty well. I really want to send special thanks to all the participants and the speakers and the discussants, in particular Margreet, who really was the mind behind the event, and she helped us organizing the program, finding the contacts. Also Fons Janssen, who's the Dutch coordinator of the European Climate Pact, to make this event possible and connecting us with the youth initiative in the JMR in the Netherlands, but also with the European Commission. So thanks again for all your participation. And happy Critical World Water Day, as someone wrote in the chat. And I hope we can really be the agents of change and continue from these important discussions on taking action. So I will also call the Dutch participants to join us in the river cleanup initiative today, and also to whoever can to take really to be mindful of our environment and do our best to keep it sustainably clean and enjoyable. So thank you so much to everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you all.